Good afternoon, sir. I'm Cadet Bergman, and today I will be briefing you on General Chuck Horner. Next slide, please. I will be talking to you about his early years, his Air Force career, and the role he played during the Gulf War. Next slide, please. General Horner was born 19th of October 1936. He was raised in a small town in Iowa called Davenport. When World War II came around, he was affected by the war, just like everyone else was. He became absolutely enamored with pilots and with flying. Pilots were his heroes. Other people respected them. He worshipped them. His cousin, Bill Miles, was actually a B-24 pilot during the war and flew a lot of bombing missions. Later on, his brother-in-law, his sister's husband, would be a pilot in training. So for young Chuck, flying and heroes went hand in hand. Unfortunately, that would also come to include death. In 1944, he came home one day to find that his cousin had been killed during a bombing mission. An artillery round had, penetrated the cockpit and killed his cousin. And then a few years after that, his brother-in-law, his sister's husband, would be killed during a training mission. So from that point on, heroism and flying would also be associated with death. And that was just, the name of the game, and he accepted that. Next slide, please. So young Chuck attended the University of Iowa. He got there and he did as little as possible to get by. He was a C average student. He spent most of his time hanging out with his friends, drinking, having a good time. The basic college experience. Unfortunately for him, his C average prevented him from getting into the medical school. So he had to reevaluate what he wanted to do. Fortunately for him, at that time, the University of Iowa required all males to be enrolled in an ROTC program. Horner had chosen to be part of the Air Force ROTC program over the Army simply on the basis that the Air Force marched less and had fewer parades. So he redirected all of this energy into the Air Force ROTC and found out that he absolutely loved it. He loved the culture, he loved the discipline, the leadership. Most of all, he loved that it brought him back to flying. He would fly on several occasions with one of his ROTC instructors in a little Ryan Navion, a little propeller two-seater jet, or not jet, aircraft. He would later fly in an Aeronca Champion and kind of learn some basic acrobatic maneuvers. So he loved flying, realized that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to fly aircraft in the Air Force. So he was commissioned into the Air Force Reserve on the 13th of June in 1958. He was later offered a full commission, and he graciously accepted. Next slide, please. Okay, so now to talk about his Air Force career. He attended his pre-flight training during October of 1958 at Lackland Air Force Base. A month later, he moved on to his primary flight training at Spence Field in Georgia. He spent 6 months flying both T-34s and T-28s, which were propeller aircraft. After that 6 months was up, he moved on and spent 6 months in the T-33 jet aircraft, honing his skills. Now, what you have to understand is at this time, the pilot program was very intensive, very tough. It had an 85% washout rate, which meant 85% of the trainees who started did not finish. Lieutenant Horner was on a mission to make sure that he would not be one of the 85% that washed out. He studied like he never studied in college. I mean, he was hitting the books every chance he got, and it showed. He excelled. He was top of his class. I mean, case in point, on one training mission, he was asked by the instructor to fly lead so that the instructor could evaluate one of the other trainees. Well, as they're coming in, you got two aircraft, one following the other. The second trainee, the other guy, starts to kind of fall back a little bit. Well, Lieutenant Horner figures that this is a great time to hone his air combat skills. So what he does is he kicks right rudder, pulls the aircraft back, does a full loop, comes in on the 6 of the other aircraft. Once he's on, behind the other aircraft, he calls out that he has a shooting solution. Gotcha, right? Well, let's say his instructors were not happy about that at all. He actually got in a whole heap of trouble. He got sent to the commander's office. He wasn't even sure if he was going to be allowed to continue in the program. Commander scolded him like he'd never been scolded before. But before he left the office, the commander looked at him and said, "Lieutenant Horner, you are going to make one hell of a fighter pilot." It was at that moment that Lieutenant Horner knew he was going to be a fighter pilot. No matter what it took, he was going to make it happen.